Well, great end of afternoon, good evening to everybody that is with us in this on webinar. This is the fourth webinar of this sequence of discussions between Brazil and Australia. And this is a project promoted by the Public Prosecutor's Office of Brasilia and Territories in partnership with the University Center, UniCeuB, with the support of the Embassy of Australia in Brazil. Those discussions, they aim at fostering and creating a collaborative network of research between Brazilian and Australian institutions in the theme of domestic violence and family violence against women. And so tonight we'll advance in this discussion with regards to the role of the police, the women's police department as something very Latin American that has presented positive results towards the prevention of domestic and family violence against women. So it is a global innovation, as Professor Carey says. Well, tonight, then, we unfortunately won't be able to have the participation of two of the panelists that have been invited. Maria Puyol, she has a commitment, an appointment with her doctorate degree, and Camila Magalhães. To, Today, she tested positive for COVID. She's not with very pleasant symptoms, unfortunately, so she won't be able to be with us. Although I've heard that other people here they have COVID, but with better and simpler symptoms, and will be able to be with us. Well, in spite of those two losses, and I'd like to uh, send my the best from Camila. She has mentioned that to me. We'll have effectively a constellation of star panelists. We'll have the presence of Professor Carrington of the University of Sunshine Coast, Dr. Leila from Feminista Sepia NGO, and Samira Bueno from the Brazilian Forum of Public Security. So tonight, our mediation will be done through or by Dr. Adriana Ramos de Melo, who is a judge of the Rio de Janeiro Justice Court, in the specialized court of violence against women in Rio, and also the professor of magistrate improvement school or enhancement school. We'll have our partners in this event. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Adriana, who will be moderating the works of the day. And I'd like to wish you all a very rich discussion tonight. Adriana, are you with us today? Well, apparently there was an instability with her connection. So while she's reconnecting, so I'd like to introduce Professor Carey, who will be our first speaker of the day. So Professor Carrington is a member of the Social Sciences Academy of Australia. She has a history of multicultural bilingual research in Pacific Islands, Australia, and she has studied this. She has studied domestic violence lingual team, led by women in Argentina that started in the 80s, how they respond and prevent gender-based violence. Professor Carrington, she has over 140 publications. She has presented over 30 lectures internationally, and even for the United Nations, UNODC. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Carrington. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Tiago. So can everybody hear me first? I just want to test the technology. And can everybody see my slides?
Yes. Ouvimos e vemos perfeitamente.
Yes, ma'am. We can hear and we can see it. Okay.
Okay, perfecto. Okay. Estoy listo. Okay, so in the there's been a very big debate in policing as to whether or not specialist police stations, mostly led by women, are a relic of the past, similar to the police in the United Kingdom and Australia and America, where women were initially only entered into the police after the Second World War as specialists, as sort of like matrons, as women to intervene and look after children or to deal with women criminals. Then the other side of that debate is that no, that's a liberal feminist interpretation, and it's mistaken because it's using as its basis to measure the progress of women in police a model that's derivative of the English-speaking countries of the global north. So if you put your biases aside, and if you look at the entry of women into police in Latin America in particular and Brazil, you see a completely different model. And if you take a Southern theoretical lens or a Southern criminological lens, you see it in its own rights and its own history and its own text, and you don't measure it against the standards of the English-speaking world. What you see instead is a unique innovation, something that this specialism has been evaluated extensively by the United Nations Women, been evaluated in Brazil quite extensively, and the results are very promising indeed. But before I continue, I'll just better mention the other two people who were part of this presentation is Professor Máximo Soso from the Universidad de Israel in Argentina, and of course Maria. Maria is the PhD student on the project, funded by the project, and her PhD is actually due today. So that's why she's not here. Okay, so so from the liberal feminist perspective then, these women's police stations are seen as relics of the past. They're seen as something backward, not something forward-looking. And this kind of an analysis is based on a global organisation of knowledge and measures progress from the English-speaking world. It's deeply problematic, and I have been an advocate for Southern theory and Southern criminology, which seeks alternative theorisations and perspectives which don't embed that bias on the global north. And what we've done in our research is taken women's police stations that emerged in 1985 in Brazil and then in 1988 in Argentina, and we've taken them to challenge that epistemology and that way of thinking and theorising and measuring, but we've also done this study to demonstrate that they can be very highly effective, more effective approach to the policing and prevention of gender violence than the models of policing and preventing gender violence in countries like Australia and the UK and Canada. Okay, so a little bit about the history of this innovation. I've already said that they were first introduced in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And this was at a time, you have to remember the context, and though some of you may be too young to remember it, I remember it. I went to Argentina in 1984, the year when it was the first year that we could get there after the demise of the military coup. And it was a very magic time in Latin America. It was a time of redemocratization, a time of rebuilding. And it was a time where women, as activists and as the women's movement in both Brazil and Latin America and Argentina, across the whole of Latin American and speaking world, became very strong and very powerful in politics. They became Nicaragua, Peru, all these places that had undergone terrible, terrible military oppressive regimes. But it was also those new social democratic regimes had to find a way to re-legitimize the police, because the police were associated with torture, abduction, oppression. And why would a woman who is suffering domestic violence or sexual abuse, why would they go anywhere near the police, who were feared instruments of torture and abduction and rape and murder? So there was also all these historical interlocking forces, the women's movement, redemocratization, and then there were all these inquiries. And in Argentina, there was Nunca Más, inquiry into the los desaparecidos, and that inquiry involved women and los madres y los padres de desaparecidos from the Playa de Mayo, and those activist groups were absolutely fundamental in saying it's the state has to take the responsibility for assisting to prevent violence against women. So there was this was an incredible historic period, and that historic period is what I suppose gave birth to this incredible innovation, because they had to create a police force separate from the colonial force. And in Argentina, they did that, and they eventually developed a completely separate police force. Okay, so that was, I've already referred to this study before, but in Brazil, they've been most extensively written about and researched in Brazil. And one study found that there was about a half of a drop in the lethal partner violence rate for younger women. And that study compared 2040 equally matched socioeconomic areas. So it is a very solid finding. Okay, but I don't have time to go into that. Lots of people in Brazil know that history better than me. Okay, so given its success then, this model took off all over the world, but the non-English speaking world. There are thousands of women and women's specialist units and troops, and they discovered that it was, and this is another paper altogether, but they discovered that when you establish women troops, women interventions, women peacemakers, women soldiers, women police, you have a lot less corruption, you have a lot less violence, and they're more effective. So, okay, but I don't have time to talk about those today. I want to talk about the emergence of police stations, of comisarias de la mujer y familia in Argentina. First established in 1988 in the context that I just described, but they had a very slow beginning. And there was only 12 established over the next kind of 16 years. Then there was, in 2009, some landmark legislation. It was the national law to prevent and eradicate violence against women. Now, this instrument and this law was something of a bit of a landmark, and at the same time, I mean, people from Brazil can talk about what was going in there, but you had Maria de la Pena, you had your own particular laws happening at the same time, but they were also, you had a very strong and active United Nations in Latin America with the view of trying to advance the aspiration to eradicate violence against women. But it wasn't really until you got masses of action around deaths and femicides, and you got the Neo Lamas movement in 2015, and when and you get the Gender Policy Unit and the Ministry of Security is established in response to that movement. That's when you start to get this massive explosion in the numbers of women's police stations, as you can see here. So by 2018, there was 128, and about 2019, there's 131. I'm not sure how many there are today, but there's at least 134. Okay, so what did we do? Well, our study, we worked in collaboration and we took 3 years to get approval, but we finally did. And so this is what we were researching. And at that time, Comisarias de la Mujer comprised one in five police stations in the province of Buenos Aires was a specialist police station, a Comisaria de la Mujer. So that's, and they employed 2,300 employees. They responded to almost 250,000 complaints, and they received at that stage over 7,000 complaints of sexual violence. So it's a systemic approach to violence against women. So we were fortunate enough to get some money from the Australian Research Council and Maximo Soso from Argentina is the PI. So this is a great example of multilingual international collaboration, just as Thiago has been pioneering this through the embassy for years as well. And this is a way we can learn, and this event today is part of that sort of collaboration. So we interviewed 10 employees from 100 overall from 10 different police stations across the entirety of the province. We selected, it was a purposeful sample of police stations that represented local, urban, suburban, in the barrios, and in El Campo, in the farming and rural communities. Of those, 19 were male. Sorry, that should be that's wrong. That should be 81 female, 19 male, 79 police officers, 21 lawyers. So the distinguishing features, as you may well know, that they're common to you in Brazil, is that they're multidisciplinary teams. There's about 25 employees at each station. They don't have holding cells. They don't respond to any other form of crime. They only respond to gender violence, and they work with lawyers and counsellors in an integrated response. And they work from a gendered perspective. They all have specialist training, and men can and do work in these specialist police stations since 2004, but they only if they have the specialist training. So what distinguishes employment now in these is not gender, but it's the training. Now, they work with local boards, mesas locales, and they work with, which represent all the other government departments in the area, and then they work with communities and the non-government sector, women's groups. Some of them actually host women's groups at their police stations. They're all child friendly. They're designed to receive victims. They're not. This makes them very cheap to run because they don't need holding cells and they don't need custodial police officers. So many of them are they appear in the suburbs, and they were established amongst the barrios, amongst the people. So they're like the people's police, and they're very much community style policing is their mode of operation. Okay, so we discovered that they prevented gender violence in three main ways, and that was that they worked with the victim and the perpetrator to denaturalize gender violence. They also stressed the agency of the victim. They did not take the agency off the victim. It was up to her, or the survivor, it was up to her to decide whether a matter was going to end up before the court or not. And in well over a half of cases of intervention, there was no formal intervention, but the violence stopped. So they used multiple prongs of intervention. Prevention was the preferred, and criminalisation was going through the courts. It's like the last resort. But they could send perpetrators to programs to unlearn their violence, and they could do that without having an apprehended violence order. And this makes them very unique, because I don't think you can do that in many other places around the world. So we thought, well, given their success, given what we know, could Australia or Canada adopt a similar model? What would be the barriers? So we did 2 surveys. I won't go through all this detail, but you can have slides after, and there's loads of publications that you can access. So we recruited nearly 300 specialists from the domestic violence field, and that of whom 63% had more than 6 years experience in the field. We recruited them through the police, through domestic violence agencies, and they represent those 277 represent a workforce of around 10,000 employees in the domestic violence sector in Australia. We then did a community survey and we did this through Facebook sampling. It cost a lot of money to do this, but it's how politicians do polls. It's they're the secret algorithms of Facebook, but in any case, they are fairly representative of people who use Facebook. So this survey was biased towards younger people and against older people, but that's because it was Facebook. We asked them both exactly the same questions. Now, question one, which is really important, was which aspects of women's police stations could improve how police stations respond to victims of gender-based violence. And in some of the in Brazil, but these were based on the Argentinian model, and that was working in multidisciplinary teams, collaborating with local agencies, providing emergency support designed to receive victims, provide childcare, undertake prevention work in the community, have interview rooms for victims, work with the perpetrator to break the cycle of domestic violence, work with victims, work from a gender perspective, staffed only by female officers. Now that was the one, these last two, staffed by female officers and operate from suburban houses, they were the two that received the least support. But you'll see here in this graph, grey is Australia, red is Canada, and dark blue, black is the UK. But you can see here a fairly consistent response that about 9 out of the 12 features of women's police stations were considered by the domestic violence workforces in those countries as being highly amenable to being implemented in those countries as a way to improve the prevention and the response to survivors of gender violence. Now you're seeing this data has not been published. The data for Australia has been published, but the data for Canada and the UK has not been published yet. So this is really exciting. I'm showing you for the very first time that this is in fact a model that Anglophone countries could well adopt, and very surprisingly, very positive reaction from the sector. Okay, question 2, we asked, ideally, how should police respond to victims of gender violence? I'm just checking my time. And here we have this part of the survey was not implemented in the UK, so you've just got Australia and Canada. And it's listen to victim stories without judging. Here you see very strong support, over 80% in both Australia and Canada agreeing with that. Work from a gender perspective that understands domestic violence as a cycle. Again, strongly agree with that in both Canada and Australia. Help victims remove offender from the home. Again, strongly agree in both Canada and Australia. Empower victims to leave a violent partner. That was, again, overwhelmingly agree or strongly agree. Allow female victims of male violence choose a female police officer to receive their complaint. Now, again, this was overwhelmingly agreed or strongly agreed if you put them both together. And this is really important because this has been a huge contention in Australia. Australia at the moment, it's a lottery, and only 25% of women are police, and you're not guaranteed of getting of being able to choose. And in fact, in Australia, it's so bad at the moment. We've got another inquiry into police culture in Queensland, of course, of the failings of policing in this state. Okay. Okay, so yes, I cut it short because I thought there were so many of us. But I'm happy to take discussion, or if you want to have it now or leave it till later. But I think it's important that you know that the failings of police are systemic, they're chronic, they're ongoing. And in Australia at the moment, there are massive issues, and they're over over a third of the women who were killed as a result of domestic violence in Queensland over the last 5 years, a third of them were misidentified by the police as the perpetrator. So the police treated these women who are at serious lethal risk of violence and who did get killed as the perpetrators and not the victims. And so there's a huge problem here with police culture, and the police culture certainly in Queensland is highly masculinist. It's not changed in 100 years. It's still the same. It's very male dominated. It's very unsympathetic to survivors, many of whom are turned away and not given appropriate support. So at the moment, there's another massive inquiry into policing, and our research team is proposing this model, and the coroners and the other courts they are now seriously for the very first time contemplating the introduction of a trial of this model in our state. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Obrigada. Todos.
Obrigada, professora Carrie. Carrie, então,
Thank you, Professor Carrie. Carrie, it was a real pleasure to learn with the Australian experience. I was pleased with your work, and also surprised to know that women in Australia, they suffer with family and domestic violence. We know this is a globalized phenomenon, unfortunately, and we were quite happy to listen to your experience. So now we have the pleasure to welcome Professor Samira Bueno, that is a partner. And first, I'd like to thank and apologize for my electricity issue that I had here, but I'm happy for being here, even with these technical issues. And also, I'd like to thank the invitation by Professor Thiago Perban, great partner from IFAN. It's a pleasure, while as a National School for Improvement of Magistrates, to share our experience from Brazil regarding fighting the violence and the importance of women's police station. That is our gateway, the main gateway for women in Brazil. So I'd like to give the floor our dear Samira Bueno Nunes. She's the executive director from Brazilian Public Security Forum, NGO, with a PhD in public administration, and also from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, with the PhD in Center of Latin American Studies from the University of Cambridge, with master's degree of public administration for the same university, and a social scientist by University of São Paulo, in addition to being a researcher and collaborator of the Public Administration Studies Center and People and Organization Studies Center of our FGV in São Paulo. Thank you, Professor Samira, and also I think the opportunity for mediating this so important debate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Adriana. It's a pleasure to see you here in other participants. I have just especially Thiago requested to make my presentation in the end and Professor later before. So maybe we can use this moment to present. I believe it was the moment that you left, right? I apologize. I'm here in the darkness using my cell phone. I hope you can see me well. Okay. Yes, it is working. So, dear Professor Leila Linhares, my inspiration, a personal inspiration for feminism, and also the fight for women's rights here in our school. She's a lawyer and a member of the experts committee EGESEC, that is our monitoring mechanism of the Belém do Pará Convention. She's also the founder and executive coordinator of the non-governmental organization CEPI, Research, State, Citizenship, Formation and Action, professor of the Magistrate School of our state in Rio de Janeiro, proudly, member of the Permanent Forum of Domestic Violence, Gender-Based Violence, of our merge and a member of the Women's Security Commission, so important commission, and the State Council for Women's Rights of our state in Rio de Janeiro, and former director of the Feminist Studies magazine that is part, and she's part, of course, of the consortium Marinho da Penha that elaborated our so important law, that is the 11340 law, Maria da Penha law, that celebrates 16 years this year. And I'm kind of embarrassed of mediating this so important debate with so relevant women for our Brazil. Good evening.
Por esse convite.
First, thank you, Professor Thiago, for the invitation. I'd like to greet Professor Carrie Carrington, our Councillor Samira Bueno, and also Adriana Mello with the task of mediating this debate about women's police station. Very briefly, I'm going to introduce the history of women's police station in Brazil. In the end of the 70s, the feminist women went to the streets to denounce the impunity of men that killed their wives. Many cases of what we name today of femicide, they took place and were highlighted in the media because many of these women, they were from middle class and high class, and then these crimes were reported by the media. What does it mean that that other crimes of women murders that weren't in the media, they didn't take place because most of them, they were poor women, and with that the media always brings these highlights when something happens with people from the middle class. So women went to the streets with the slogan that who is fat doesn't kill. And during the military coup dictatorship in this movement started in 75. So in 85, one of the women's demand was in fact an attention, and more than that, an specialized system to welcome the women's demand. In Brazil at the time, the violence against women was considered that a fight between men and women, and the society agreed and banalized this violence. And in this sense, the women's movement sheds light to this so silenced violence. In 1985, with the creation of the National Council for Women's Rights, it was the year that the first women's police stations were created in Brazil. Actually, before the creation of these stations, women's group, they were organized in SOS Women. Voluntarily, they provided legal assistance and psychosocial assistance to women in violence situation. In 1985, the National Council for Women's Rights, with the research with the title "When the Victim is a Woman," and the research showed clear that in case of domestic violence, most of the victims were women. The women were beaten at home, and the men on the streets, most of them. And this research was confirmed in 1989 when the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics had a research on the victimization where it was clear that there was a specificity of violence against women. And in 1989, we had the first police stations where the design was designed proposed by the feminist movement. We wanted a police station with a female staff, basically, especially the police, the station chief. We want a specialized station. One means that we expected these stations to understand what was domestic violence against women, where the women would find a better welcoming. And because the experience showed when the women went to regular stations. Most of the case, they were encouraged to give up on the complaint. So the idea of a specialized station comes from this history of Brazilian police, the civil police in Brazil, of not considering these complaints against women relevant. And these stations are extended from the 80s, and today we are able to say that women's police station, they increased the number, but actually they do not cover more than 20% of the total amount of municipalities in Brazil. We have 5,550 municipalities. In a very recent research from 2020 showed that we have around 400 women's police stations, and it represents less than 20% of the total police stations, comparing with the number of municipalities in Brazil. What shows that an expansion took place, but it was a very limited expansion. And it was limited due to the fact that not all stations are open and 24/7 and in the weekends. And it's important to understand that this public security policy impacts the state due to the feminist movement pressure. In 1994, when the Inter-American Convention for Eradication, Prevention, and Punishment of Violence Against Women was approved, the fight of women against violence was strengthened with this convention for OAS that we consider physical, sexual, domestic violence, the violence perpetrated by people from the state or members of the community. And actually, has a very broad aspect of violence against women, not only focus on domestic and family violence. And certainly, women's police station that started to help women in violence, in domestic situation, somehow they start to welcome women, to receive women that were victimized by gender-based violence that takes place out of the domestic environment, particularly the violences that are characterized of by gender-based violence. The fact that that person is a woman. So of this, the hate and all these feelings behind that. And also, all the conference in the 90s also strengthened the feminists, the men, as the action plan from the Cairo and Beijing conference shed light the issue of violence against women. More than that, they demanded from the state very objective provisions so this violence will be prevented, and also to have the victims under their attention, and also the impunity should not become a regular fact within the society. So the women's police station policy became very recognized policy by women. Women, they go to women's police station. And through the SEPA, through the organization that I am the executive director, in 1994, by the research that was published, named Violence Against Women, a public policies assessment. And so it was a research developed a few years after the creation of the first police stations, where it was possible to identify a criminality that wasn't in place so far, not only domestic and physical aggressions, but also rapes, the sexual abuses and violations. It gave visibility to sexual violence against children in situations of crimes against women.
Enfim, contra a moralidade das mulheres, e hoje em dia a gente sabe que há toda uma violência cibernética também. Então, o que a gente vê é que essa
So what we
política
see is that this policy that was
a partir
involved,
de 2003,
well, was
quando
developed from 2003 when
a presidência do então
the
presidente
chair,
Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva,
when the
ele
chairmanship of or actually the presidency of the administration of Lula da Silva, and he creates a secretariat for women. And this secretariat has promoted a great exchange with the women's movement. And from this exchange and from these actions of feminist groups, it was in 2006 the Maria da Penha law that comes to increase in an effective way the attribution station. So it's not a matter of investigation, but to host, to receive, to hear, to provide this environment for women in a series of recommendations that the Secretariat makes that the Maria da Penha law ends up incorporating. In this very year, in 2006, as the Women's Secretary Policy Secretariat of Policies for Women has launched a guideline on how the women's stations should work. And this is extremely important. We have this document. It is, well, but well, it has all the guidelines on how a women's police station should work, and and the guidelines on of international conventions. Uh, eh, so those guidelines, they are in fact fundamental. So it is important to perceive that the women's stations, they did not have the attribution to investigate the femicide crimes, the murders, the so-called femicides. They're specialized. So there is a demand of the women's movement for them to be, well, to create specialized stations for femicide. So in this public policy of strengthening of the women's stations, well, there was a very recent procedure of the United Nations with the Brazilian administration that has established the national guidelines to investigate, uh, sue, and judge. Well, those guidelines call the attention for the need of the members of the justice system and security systems to look into the violence against women with the gender perspective. So those guidelines certainly were guided by the recommendation 33 of the committee that talks about the elimination of gender stereotypes, race stereotypes, ethnicity, and the need of understanding the different uh, uniqueness for a woman when she goes to this, well, to be in this situation of more vulnerability. More recently, in 2021, the National Council of Research, which is an, an agency that was created for the judiciary to work with the judiciary police, they approve what was a technical guideline to work in the judiciary policy to tackle the violence against women that will incorporate the need of the gender perspective, intersectoriality in the assessment of violence against women, being in the scope of the security areas as well as the justice institutions. And we could say, I'm about to close. We could say that well, doing this assessment for today with some academic work and from our militants and from our very practice into following the violence against women, we could say that there is a need indeed of a permanent training of the police forces in the justice uh, area, and to for them to be monitored. Perhaps monitoring is not being the main point that has not taken forward. There is no monitoring. We have what we have is statistics. The state of Rio has provided very good statistics from the Public Prosecutors Institute, where when we know the numbers of the different crimes that took place, but we do not have national protocols to monitor how the stations are working. And another point that weakens this policy to violence against women is the hardship of the network uh, procedure. Because in some places, like in Rio, we can have inarticulate actions with the women's stations, the reference centers of attention for women in violence. But this network, this informal networks, still brings a lot of frailties throughout the countries. And I would conclude by calling the attention to how important it is for what the the police has, well, from changes in the Maria da Penha law, which is the possibility of the protective measures, and how those protective measures take place in the scope of the civil police, because many times they may not protect women as a whole, because in fact these women do, they have the right to have the public defenders working with them to guide them and to hear them, and to for this woman to enter the justice system more strengthened. But I believe something new besides those guidelines and this fight against fighting this violence against women. There are two factors. First, there's the feminist uh, militants. The women are hearing what the women are saying, and upon hearing them, the feminist movement, they also have tried to dialogue with the deputies that lead those stations. And uh, also, we talk about the needs of training the personnel that works at those stations, but also to train all police stations in general in such a way that the women may look for the women's stations, but where there isn't, they can have a good service provided to them. And the research that Professor Carey has brought to us is extremely important for us to realize the level of acceptance of the stations. We believe in Brazil this level is quite good, but we need to know how women assess it. So not only the ones that had service provided, but also the law professionals, the attorneys, the defenders, the judges, for us to have a better awareness from society with regards to those devices, let's say, that we consider to be so necessary, bearing in mind the high rates of violence against women in Brazil, and particularly the high rates of femicide. Thank you very much. And let's continue with Dr. Samira. Thank you. What a responsibility to talk after Professor Carey and Professor Leila. So, as the youth here in Brazil says, I don't have an outfit for that. Well, I'd like to thank Adriana. It is a pleasure to have you with us and all the team. So, Adriana, if I go over my time, please let me know. Okay. Just you can voice it because I won't be able to see you. So first, I'd like to talk about the place where I'm talking from, and just for you to understand why I bring so many data. The Brazilian Forum of the Public Security, the organization that I direct, is a 6-year-old organization that has public security officers who have police officers, researchers, activists, and 40% of our people are agents or police agents. So this forum was created with this purpose of producing data and evidences on public security, building alternatives, and well, Brazil has had a military dictatorship, and the process of redemocratization has been because, well, it's still happening. It has been tough. So to get closer to the police and the construction of public policies in a joint fashion, understanding that public security is more than just policing, and this needs to be built by all. That's what motivates our actions. Well, let me just share my screen really quick. No, let me put that from the beginning. I believe you can see it, right? Is it okay? So this forum comes with this purpose, and from that on, we have some actions that are quite strategic. The first, with the production of data and evidence. So in the first minutes, I'll spend showing some recent data on gender violence in Brazil that strengthened the importance of everything that Professor Kerry and Professor Leila have talked about, and even seeing the comments in the chat and seeing the profile of the ones who are with us. This shows a sample of the the challenges that we have, that our professionals that are in the front line and have faced in the past few years. I believe the pandemic has brought new challenges for the police officers and many other professionals that work in the front lines. I know Professor Adriana has tried to find ways to improve the service and to reach women under violence during the social distancing moment. And we're going to show other works. We're bringing two projects that I believe they're they're very important. And so the first what is Casoteca. This is a project where we document using a simple term, the idea of good practices. How can we produce knowledge on public policies that have shown as successful and has changed the lives of women under violence in organizational knowledge? As it is hard to produce data and assess our public policies, how can we look at public policies that are being implemented and produce knowledge on, on the so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So this exchange of knowledge of professionals, well, this is something that is fundamental. We, in the second edition or the third edition of this project, we have highlighted an initiative by Tiago in the Public Prosecutor's Office of Brasilia, and also Adriana, the project from Rio, so have documented. Most of initiatives are developed by the police, the justice system. We're in the fourth year of the project, looking at initiatives that developed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this second moment, well, this is a guide that we have developed with the partnership with Uber that talks about pedagogical principles to train the professionals. I mean, how to incorporate gender perspective into that, and because we talk to this public security professionals, and and those public security organizations, they are male, they have much more male professionals, and we need to teach them this gender view. These are two guides that suggestions, so I won't take too long on that. I just wanted to bring data on that. So things that we need to address that may help us to think those challenges and how we're seeing this violence against women and girls. I bring recent data This is, well, femicides in 2021. The legislation is from 2015. So we see some states that have a great challenge of measuring that. This data we produce from the collection of the data with the civil police. So of the 27 units of the Federation, and we've had 1,300 femicides in Brazil. This is a setback compared to 2020 when we had 1,351, but we're talking about a reduction of 30 cases, 32 victims. So it's almost stability. And we have women victims of femicides every 10 hours and every 2 hours in Brazil. And so there is still 1,400 murders of women a year. So, and these are the ones that the civil police that qualified as femicide. This is the first document in the police report. So we can have more femicides in the moment that public prosecutor's office or the attorneys, they receive this report from the police. So in here, we have data separated by semester, and this shows this data was going up when you see the first semester of 2019, 2020, and 2021, and we see those numbers, they keep growing, and this, what we saw last year, it happens in the second semester of last year. So here, I'm bringing okay. So you see the rate of femicides by state in Brazil. This gives us a sample of the difference between the states. So the is 1.2 per 100,000, but this varies deeply from state to state in strengthening. And there are states that don't classify accordingly femicide. So we see the case of Ceará, which is the most shocking, because Ceará is the state where Ms. Peña has suffered violence, that she has issues so far, and they could be a gender violence uh, cornerstone, but we see very few cases are seen as femicide in Ceará. The average in Brazil is 35%. Around 35% of all murders against women have been seen as femicide, and basically they're intimate, as I say, they're perpetrated by their partners. I believe, Adriana, in your state, Rio, this is not so different. In Brasilia, probably not so different. Another challenge that the police and the women's police departments have had in their daily lives, well, has to do with sexual violence. And this is another piece of data that we have been monitoring for over 10 years that has been growing. It was a little decrease in 2020, and we believe this fall in rapes in different reports of violence against women has more to do with the fact that many of these women, they did not have access to these devices much, or instead of these women were not victims. So they decreased in 2020, they raised in 2021, and this is just sexual violence against girls and women. The Brazilian legislation brings males as victims of rape, and this number increases. So considering only women and girls, with over 55 cases of rapes and rapes of minors. And it's important to highlight here that when we talk about the femicide, we talk about women, mostly Black women, that die by the hands of their partners between 18 and 44. But when we talk about sexual violence, it's a violence that happens before.
So mainly 64% of victims are girls under 13 years old. So we are talking about children most of the times that suffer the sexual violence in their homes with their stepfather, fathers, cousins. So I'm showing this data just to express the vision from this police officer, the professional, the law enforcement agent in the police stations of this hardship to look at the children of 8, 9 years old, sexually abused within their home, for the woman killed by her partner there for many times in their social mindset and then in the imaginary of this officer that it's doesn't consider this as a criminal or as a fixed job that is father plays soccer on Sundays. Yeah, he has friends for many times for this law enforcement officer. It is difficult to process, to understand that the perpetrator of this violence is this figure. It's not the that regular criminal related to drug trafficking, always armored. So it's a different profile. And also to finish another survey that we developed last past year. It's a survey on victimization that we have now the concept. Basically, we have to estimate the size of subnotification because we know that many the women that suffer violence, they don't go to a police station. They will not call the military police, neither to the hospital unity, due to embarrassment, fear. So since 2017, we just closed the data of this survey, trying to understand the main source of violence suffered by Brazilian women and women of above 16 years old, and how they have been dealing with these situations. An extensive survey, and it's available at the forum website. But I want to highlight some data that relates to the speakers that we have today. First, the victimization of women during the first year of pandemic. So this survey, the time frame is the end of April the past year. So it's the period, the first 12 months of the pandemic in Brazil. And it pointed out many issues, and one of them was a number of situations that these women lived. She was cursed, offended. Basically, we are trying to understand some sort of moral violence, psychological violence, patrimonial violence, sexual, physical violence. So we bring examples. Did anyone try to have forced sexual relation with you? And what we understood in the first year of the pandemic, 1 in 4 Brazilian women suffered some sort of violence, and the most frequent violence was verbal violence, cursing, humiliation, embarrassment, and the profile. And of what we know from the data available, especially with Black women, that they are larger than the victims, and have a specific research on the pandemic of COVID-19. And we can see that women that lost their job and have the income and reduction, they suffered violence. So we see this economic aspect related with the hardship of the women to leave the violent situation. So in the next slide, I have a data specifically on the search for military police or the police station. And the majority of the they didn't anything about the violence. 40% of them, they didn't anything. There is something changing in these 6 years of survey that is important to call your attention. First, regarding the appearance of the women in the police station. So these women that reported violence, suffered domestic violence, they went to the police station. These data are increasing from in 2019 and 2017. Second, the 911 interactions, that is the police hotline, and 7% affirmed that they called the 911. In our case, 190. And through the monitoring that we have in our forum, we have seen that we frequented them more and more. The police stations, the women, they look for the women's police station when they have an opportunity. Some innovations during the pandemic enable the state to provide electronic channels for the complaint. So the electronic police stations, they have been used by women in violence situation, but mainly what we have is the call, the military police calls. To head in the end, I know that I don't have that much time. Some challenges that we have in looking at these innovations and how this service is being provided. Leila talked about that, but the specialized police stations for women, they are concentrating in metropolitan and urban and capital areas. Have less than 10% of municipalities have this structure. They are very important, but they are still concentrated in these areas. So how can we expand this service for women? And also, most of the protective measures, the urgent protective measures, they are issued by the police stations. It's being the main gateway for women to issue an urgent protective measures to access the benefits from Maria da Plena law. This structure in the police stations are very important. The hotline 911, the use, they are increasingly growing. And the question is how the military police are handling this situation. We know that's been common that the police create, for instance, patrols. The municipal guards create patrol specific unities to serve women in violent situations, to monitor and follow up the urgent protective measures issued and enforced. And these structures are important, but we don't have any data on its efficiency, effectiveness, and we have to follow up this experience to understand, to have a better understanding of this work. But in reality, the women that call 911 will be attended by a common regular patrol in the area. Many times we don't know what is the follow-up, as we don't have an integration with the systems between the military police and the civil police. When these women goes to the civil police, she was attended before by the military police. So we have the challenge to integrate the police services in the state and also to understand the women's flow. And also, as I said in the beginning, incorporating this gender perspective in the law enforcement officers, the instruction, the formation of and training of the police, they are based on the legal aspects and also to understand the legislation, etc. But to know the law by itself does not assure a proper service for the women. So to integrate this gender perspective is a welcome investigation to assure that the law enforcement officer will understand the perspectives that will characterize the gender-based violence that are not present in other sort of violence. To highlight the importance of this innovation that have been seen during the pandemic with the electronic police stations, virtual services in Sao Paulo. We have this virtual 24/7 service when the woman goes to a police station. As Leila said, most of the women's police stations are not open at 24/7. It's only in the weekdays. And you know that in the many municipalities, this violence takes place in the weekends, at night. So many times when the moment that the woman needs the service, the structure, the station is not open. So I have this recent innovation that if she goes to a police station in the inward of the country, it can be attended by a center of women's police station that is connected virtually with a, a video conference or a call. So if she is inside the regular police station, but will be welcomed, attended by a specialized staff. It doesn't replace the structure of women's police, but it is a solution that will impact the public policy on the financial aspect and can be considered for expansion. Another topic that Leila raised, and maybe this one of the most decisive in order to conceive the stations, police stations today, in the improvement of the service. It has to do with protocols. So today the protocols, they are different. Each police force has their own. And many times when there is less constraint to train the specialized staff, but not necessarily is offered for all the professionals. So may probably other professions will face a situation with a woman in a violence situation. So how can we think in the leadership from the Ministry of Justice and the federal government to standardize the procedures and also the capacity building to ensure that each police officer knows how to shoot, they will know how to manage the situation. So it's not only to provide a service in a, a station in weekend needs to find a proper service. Also, the two recent laws that will contribute to change this framework. The first is law 14330 for the Women's National Plan for Prevention of Violence. And also when Leila and Kelly spoke on the journey for public policies for women and the work towards this topic, but we know the Minister of Justice was always shy in embracing the policies for violence based on gender. If the Minister of Justice does not undertake and embrace these policies, we will not have positive outcomes. Have the National Public Security Fund have specific resources to fund actions in this area. So the expectation with the implementation of this law is to have the possibility to have more resources from the federal government to these towards this policy. What doesn't mean that Ministry of Justice we're not capable to do it. So unfortunately, we have no resources today from the Ministry of Family and Human Rights to implement public policies to fight violence, gender-based violence. That would be the natural ministry to do, and also to strengthen the network where we can integrate the policy forces, the court with the legal branch, the defender's office, and also the data generation. The data that I showed in the beginning of the presentation are data produced by the civil society. It's very hard work through information access legislation, requesting data from the states, but we need to have the leadership from the federal government. So we have the public security information system since 2012, and it doesn't disclose and monitors currently the violence against women till today. So we approved last year that is the national structure for information, and we need the federal government to do the play its role to understand the violence that these women are suffering, and also to assure that these policies will be assessed, monitored, evaluated, and better implemented for those who are in the front line, and also to facilitate the work that of those who are offering these services in the front line. So in general, I would like to thank, I'm sorry, I believe I got over time, but I am here for the discussion. Thank you.
Obrigada, Samira.
Thank you, Samira. Samira always updating us with relevant data. There is no way to interrupt her. We want to listen all this data. So I'm glad of those. And for me, as a member of the justice system, and I see in front of the chart of the survey that you mentioned, the third version, and it impacted the data, the outcomes, complemented also Leila's speak that is so important also from what Professor Carey said, that this survey, what was my attention, and also not most of them, but also the considerable part of women, they do not look for the protection system and the police. And around 32.8% decided to solve their own, and 18% judged that it wasn't important to call the police. So the women, they use the social media, they close support network, and they avoid to go to the police with fear or embarrassment, or also with the discredit that the justice has about the arguments and voices from women. So this is a data that impacted me a lot, this survey, and also what we said in also mentioning what Leila said on welcoming these women, though the police station, especially the specialized police station, to be a space to collect the complaint, to register that criminal demand. It is important also to be a space for an active listening, to welcome them, to make these women comfortable to report the violence with no sort of discrimination. Also, Professor Leila said about the capacity building that is important, and also Professor Karen, how it is important in police that we had that I saw in Australia. Here we have this capacity building focused on gender. We know that this capacity building is crucial for public security and also for justice. We have very important laws such as Maria da Penha law, the elderly statute, the people with disability statute, and also for protection of children and adolescents. We have legal frameworks that are very important, valuable, that are treated international conventions for human rights protection for women, but it's not all about that we have to talk. We are talking about another part that is really the front line of justice access. How women, although the Maria da Penha law, they still suffer prejudice, discrimination. And I'm not going to mention one or another institution because all of them, we are part of the justice system. So when we talk about public security and justice, we are talking about the public defenders of women. We are talking about the work of the ministry, the also focus on gender, that it's very important. The military police, and here I integrate, as you said, Samir, the municipal guards, the civil guards that are part of the police forces of the state through the Maria da Penha patrol. The service here in Rio de Janeiro, there is an excellent service that our municipal guard provides, that is very well qualified. But this is not the reality of all the municipalities in Brazil. More than 5,000 municipalities, a huge country, a continental country. The same women that suffers violence here in Rio de Janeiro has other characteristics in the Pará state, such as the indigenous women in the Amazonia. So it's a very complex culture, and it's a huge challenge to assure the right to access to justice to all women with no distinction. I think that this is the challenge for Brazil. In my opinion, as a direct applier of Maria da Penha law, I feel that the challenge is to have these women to have their fundamental right of justice access with all integrity. The Public Defender's Office for Women, mentioned by Leila and also by Samira, it's important to assure these women during the police query and all the criminal procedure process the right of free legal assistance from the public defender's office when available, or from institution or legal assistance service. A well-informed woman at the police station, aware of their rights, will be capable to claim their rights properly. And perhaps I have a lot of questions here. I will check in the chat box. I will ask some questions, but I have a question for Professor Carey and also for all the speakers here, Samira and Leila, but especially out of curiosity, as I have while as a Brazilian judge, I think that the legal branch is part of this fight, the courts, that they have this to create the focus on it, because we don't have women's police station in the more than 5,000 municipalities in Brazil, so the women need to count on any police station that can go briefly and be well serviced or independent of being specialized or not. Of course, specialized police station is better if available, but this is not the reality of our Brazil. So let's work with our reality. The reality is that we don't have the specialized service in all the municipalities. But I'd like to know how it is in Australia, the justice engagement, where Australian judges interact with all the system, public security, health system, education, because here in Brazil, with Maria da Penha law, Article 8 establishes that violence, to prevent violence, needs this operational integration between the legal branch with all the areas. So the Article 8 provides that. So for me, it's one of the most important norms in Article 8, that in this lacking the full implementation with capacity building, operationalization, all the levels of curriculum, education campaigns. So there are different mechanisms that are still missing to be established, especially on prevention against violence in Brazil. So I'd like to listen regarding this integration of justice with other systems in Australia, if you may, and then I can ask all the questions from the chat and thank the participation of everyone. So please.
Okay, gracias. Obrigada. Okay. Carol. So in Australia, we have a federated structure, I think, like Brazil and Argentina, where you have separate states and then a national government over the top. But the legislation for responding to gender violence resides in the state, not the national level. And so we have a lot of inconsistency between the state and the national. And some states have much better laws than others. So, for example, Victoria and Tasmania.
Just a minute, teacher, just a minute, because we don't have translation. I don't know if the service is working or not. Just, I don't know if we can have a translation.
Adriana, é só clicar no globinho ali e apertar em inglês, tá funcionando a tradução.
Tá, ok. Thank you so much.
Okay, so do you want me to answer?
Okay, you can go. You can.
Go ahead, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You
Okay,
can go.
so in Australia we have national and state. It's mostly the state that implements the laws, and that all the courts and all there are all separate jurisdictions. Now, there is a lot of inconsistency. There is very little collaboration, and that we have a national action plan to prevent violence against women. It has no teeth. It has not worked. In the last 30 decades, I can show you a graph. The rate of homicide, the lethal violence against women has remained static for 30 years. It's the most important measure. And so what we've been doing in Australia for 30 years has not cut it, has not worked. We need much better approaches. We don't have specialist police. We have very, very male-dominated police stations. Most women do not report. If they do report, many women are dissatisfied with the service. We have inquiry now, a big inquiry into, because it's very machista, very, very male-dominated. As I said before, there's so many failings. But so Australia does not have a system that's worthy of reproducing anywhere else around the world. It's seen as a failure. There's our national action plan was a failure. There's been no improvement in 3 decades, none, in lethal violence against women. And that is a huge problem. And that's partly, I think it's because there hasn't been enough emphasis on prevention. Giago would know that. There hasn't been enough emphasis on collaboration, like an integrated approach, like collaboration across government departments, like across health and education and police. There's been a complete profound lack. And most of the sector that responds to domestic violence, they're not the government, They're what we call non-government workers, and they're chronically underfunded. They're chronically over demand. And Samira, exactly the same happened in Australia during COVID. We had masses. Initially, there was much less demand because women were locked down with their perpetrators and they could not access justice. That's what your figures show that. That's what our figures show as well. But then once they were unlocked, then there was a massive increase in the numbers reporting domestic violence in particular. So I wouldn't, Australia is far off. I mean, in theory, the Maria de Pena law is regarded as one of the best in the world by the United Nations. I think from listening to the speakers, your massive issue is inequality, inequality between the states. And if you had a look at your femicide rates for Sao Paulo and the urban states, they are some of the lowest in the world. They are the lowest in the world. What you've got in those states where you do have the resources and you have the gender perspective and you have the women's police stations working with the military and the other police, you have got a much lower rate of femicide. It's all the other states. You have masses of inequality. You have much more Indigenous women. You have migrant populations. You have border populations. They're where I think Brazil has the biggest problem. And it's all about inequality. You've got the solutions. You just don't have the resources to put the solutions in place across your massive country. But at least you've got the solutions. Australia doesn't have them. Doesn't have any of them. Doesn't even recognise femicide as a crime. We have the lowest rates of conviction almost in the world for sexual assault. Less than 2% of all victims of sexual assault would ever get justice. Model or anything much.
Thank you, Carrie. Eu fico realmente impactada de ouvir.
I am impacted to hear that because femicide
fenômeno
is a phenomenon
globalizado.
that is global. So we see that it happens all around the globe, any country. And nobody can say that, well, you don't have gender-based crime anywhere. And it is very hard to work with the reality, as you have mentioned, because, of course, men and women must work towards the end of violence. We recognize the role of men. And just today, I was teaching for the new judges that just entered the career, started a career as magistrates in the state of Rio. We have 52 new judges, and I was talking to them about what is not in the code letter of the law, because the law, Professor Carey, it has a process ritual, how to have a hearing in the penal code according to the civil code in Brazil. It says that they judge what they should do at a hearing, but it doesn't talk about receiving that person well and how this hearing should be held very carefully as the Brazilian process, civil process law. And how it doesn't talk about how to receive that person and how human it should be and how human rights driven we should be. So the great challenge is to train men and women, because it is very hard for us to have only women in police stations or just female judges or prosecutors or female prosecutors. So the gender focus, Professor, and I believe Samir and Argentiago may agree, but I believe this focus should be to everybody that are part of the justice system, because it is something that has to do with all society, not only myself as a judge that should do this work of being free of myths and stereotypes and recognize the historic inequality that Brazil has had and the historic debt with regards to the Black and Indigenous population that was here way before we arrived and before our ancestors were. and this type of humanized uh, service. So I was impacted to hear you because we always expect that. Well, I expected in Australia, though there are devices to protect women, but I expected to count on the Australian system, and women there could count on it as well. But femicide, as it happens in Australia and the United States, and it happens in Chile and Argentina and others. Um, Thank you very much for your participation. There are other questions that I will read them out. I'll read a comment of one of the members that I thought it was very interesting. Let me see if I find it. I see compliments in several police officers, and I tell you, the Maria da Penha patrol, as well, being men and women, how they provide the service, and in this monitoring and oversight of urgent protective measures. And I bring a doubt of our colleague Mariana Melo, who's here with us. She says, as said by Professor Leila, in 1985, the feminist movement manifests the need of special services for women to be composed by a female team. And would it be enough to have a quota for women in the public security system, a parallel measure together? So, as the with bringing at least 30% or 30 to 70% of female as quota for women, and to try and decrease the work of women in social intervention. And Mariana asks that, and I believe we'll answer that, and then I'll go to the next question that I will locate from our colleague in the chat. So, Professor Leila, please. Well, it is this question is very interesting because when the first police station of for women was created, there were no women deputies, and so it was necessary to promote Professor Marlee Preston. She was the first lawyer for women in Rio. And we always say that the movement of women allowed these women to join in the civil police. And this has been growing. I don't know how many women we have in the civil police. I believe there is an issue now, and we are demanding gender quota, racial quota, and this is a very interesting theme, an important one. But it is important that first to perceive that this will happen if the women in the police or the women in the police stations, if they could demonstrate that they make the difference in terms of service, because many times uh, a woman leading the office does not guarantee that the other women will have service provided. So I believe it's a lot more strengthening women who are in the deputy position, and inspectors and the other and the whole team of the civil police that incorporates it. But we don't have this illusion that we we would just have service provided by women. There are many positive experiences of deputies, female deputies that made a difference, but in fact, this is not data from around the country, okay? I believe that, in fact, building on that, well, Leila, I remember that we had a legislation here in the state, especially in the coroner's office that said, or the specialist office, that the the girls should be seen by female doctors, and we have this quantity of having. Well, we need to have enough women for all institutes, and I believe this would be the best world. We know that the service provided by women, especially in sexual violence, is important to have uh, women to provide services. to girls, but we understand that we can't have all women and exclusively in all places. Of course, a percentage would be interesting, and I'd like to ask Professor Samira to hear this percentage that mostly are women, or 50%, or a good amount of women in specialized police department. I believe I've heard recently a survey, but I don't know the source. Perhaps Samira, that knows a lot about data and statistics, may tell us about the women's department to be that is headed by not only by women but by men. I believe that a great this survey came out, I believe, some 2 weeks ago, and I couldn't get where it was from, and talk about the importance of the women's police stations to be led by women. Even well, they can't. They may have deputies or agents, male agents, but I wanted to hear the opinion of Samira and our colleagues, and also another point that is that that I hear, which is a specialized police department for specialized in investigation of femicides. We understand that femicide is not a crime that is easy to see who was the perpetrator, because the femicide, well, femicide leave marks. I mean, but an investigation with a perspective of gender makes a world of difference. So preservation of the scene, the body of this woman talks a lot, and we had a research about femicide, and a great deal women. I mean, there was even a test to identify prior sexual violence, and the investigation, the specialized investigation, is important. And I'd like to hear all of you in there with regards to the importance of having this uh, view, this different view in public prosecutor, because this has happened in the Márcia Barbosa case, and this was in the commission of the Maria da Penha, uh, of this investigation of femicide, and the attempted and perpetrated in the scope of public security. So I pass the floor to all three of you who would like to talk about this, well, this suggestion of question, please. Eliana, if you allow me, I have sent you the link. You have mentioned the survey. In fact, it just came out. Was at Jornal Hoje. Yes, yes, it was. And I just shared the link. It is an article that in English that is in English, that was published by Public Administration Review by the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, that will show that the cities that have women, specialized women's police departments, they had a better reduction of femicides. And something that they will show in this article as well is that it makes a world of difference to have a woman leading this department, but the impact was more within white women than with black women. And a couple of years ago have shown this violence atlas that we use, health, and that Brazil in the last decade has reduced the white women's murders, but it has grown the black women's murder. So those small advances we've had, in fact, they are very unequal, which shows what Kerry has mentioned. When we look at urban municipalities with better infrastructure, you have one result. But when we look at municipalities uh, that doesn't have as much uh, devices, and you have more women uh, in danger, well, have that problem. And this article brings a bit of this reflection.
Regarding the quotas, as you mentioned, I believe that is the version. You want about to talk to the chart?
Yes. Can I?
Yes.
Go ahead. Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Professor.
Okay. I just want to show you this chart here. Sorry. Can you see this chart? It shows you the homicide rate per 100,000 in Australia. The top line sides, it's reduced dramatically. The red line is homicides of women, domestic homicides of women, and you can see it's remained fairly static. And the bottom line is stranger homicides, which have not changed much. But you can see, so the laws in Australia and our justice systems have benefited largely men. The male rates of homicide have reduced dramatically. Female rates of domestic homicide, not at all. And we do, and so to go back to Adriana's question, it is fundamental that we have specialist responses in justice to victims of domestic and sexual violence, because they are gendered crimes. And if you don't have a gendered response, they will not get justice. And as you can see here, the rates of hospitalisations of women have also gone up. The rates of domestic violence reports have gone up. And that's because in Australia over the last 3 decades, we have ungendered. We've removed gender. We've removed anything specialist in response to the men's rights movements. And they dominate the police, they dominate politics, and they don't want a specialised response. But this does not mean it has to be women only. It means that it should be, we need to take men on the journey as well. And in Argentina now, since 2004, the specialised response to victims of gender violence, men can be fully partners in that. They can be police, they can be counsellors, they can be lawyers. It's not about gender, it's about a specialist response. And the question before about quotas, I can share you some information. Putting quotas on police, the number of women police in England, Australia, America has not worked. It just does not work, and it will never work because they are masculinist institutions at their core. They excluded women at their core, and they continue to. So when women enter those institutions, they often become part of the machista culture, because to survive in them, they have to become like the men who dominate them. So it's a much more complicated answer. And I do think Samira was absolutely spot on. You do have the solutions, and they're specialists. It's just that there's so much inequality. It's primarily white women who are benefiting, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it would be much better if there was more resources embedded in those states where you have Indigenous women, and in the border zones of Brazil, you have lots of migrating women very vulnerable to femicide. So that's your issue is, as Samira said, it's the inequality and the lack of resources. You do have the solutions, you just don't have the resources. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll unshare.
Obrigada, Carrie, Samira.
Thank you, Carrie, Samira. You want to speak, Samira, please? Yes, just to add information on quotas. I don't know if everybody knows, but as you, Adriana, reinforced the role that today the patrols within the military police forces, the municipal guards, the role that they have in the implementation of the overseeing of urgent protective measures. And also when you talk about quotas to have a more female participation, today the civil police, they have around 45% of women in their staff. So the police is changing with more and more female participation. When you talk about military police, most of the states, they still limit the women's participation. Ceará state, for instance, is one that has this ceiling, 10% are reserved for women. It's the smallest percentage for female participation in the police forces in the country. But we say, man, this is out of the constitution. Yes, it is. But there is the ceiling. There are amount of municipal guards that reproduce this model. So we have two challenges here. One, the rupture with that. I mean, this is absurd. In the past days, I saw a public service application for military police in the Mato Grosso do Sul state. And there are the positions for military police and soldiers, and also the positions for doctors and veterinary residencies quota. So 4 positions, one for women. The new vacancies, 1,000 jobs for soldiers, 100 for women. So if more than 100 women is approved in the application, they are not entitled. So this is the hardship to identify the women's apartment. So these organizations shall qualify the service in the front line that should welcome these, receive these women in violent situations. It's an institution that can't incorporate more than 10% of women in institution. It's not, I'm not mentioning leadership position. Actually, it's the integration in the force, the police force. So we don't have that in the judicial branch, the civil police, but the military police and some municipal guards, they still reproduce this model, and many of them, okay? And I think that this is another challenge for us to overcome.
Com certeza. Eu acho que é até uma questão assim.
Of course, I think that this is an issue to be studied, this limitation. Based on what? Only 10% of the police staff is female. So this is something left from a truly paternal system and sexist system. And we have called paragraph 1 that establishes, I mean, that is the greatest quality principle established there, and also the product of the Constitution, supreme values such as equality and justice. These are supreme values of the Republic of the Brazil. So this is something to reflect. Well, because if we want, if we're fighting for women in these public security for women with the police, with 10% of female staff, it means that they will not have female police officers enough to handle a problem, a phenomenon that is generalized, because this is a very interesting, something very interesting that we are discussing here in this debate, to reflect on this public service application that limit women's participation, because this is not a quota to facilitate. And actually, this is the limitation.
Pois não, Leila, eu queria que
Yes, Leila, please. I will give the floor to add some comments on that. I think that it's possible that this 10% that Samira mentioned are for administrative roles and not in the law enforcement officer, the officer. And this is very interesting because in the end, it will be a conception from the military police that the women's place is at home or within the administrative job. So an institution with this so old-fashioned perspective regarding the women's potentiality can welcome women, can receive and serve women. So these are the problems we have in Brazil, and at the same time, we see that though we have the technical framework, normatives, and the past documents that we have from the National Council of Justice,
ainda é uma estrutura do Estado.
In fact, what we have is a state structure that does not incorporate the gender aspect in none of their great lines. And it doesn't incorporate the violence against women as a state issue. So each state of Brazil, if the governor is better and understands better the situation, but it is, though the Brazil have signed all the international treaties and our constitution itself, in the case of violence against women, calls it a constitutional issue, actually fighting violence against women, the policies for prevention, attention, networks creation, integration has been not undertaken as a state policy. And what happens in every administration change in different Brazilian states ends weakening historically what they have been since that the recent policies they have been depreciated institutions towards women's attention, and the efforts for violence prevention are weakened and they are almost new. So what happens is violence increasing with no national policy for violence prevention. In general, the homicide rate in Brazil, they are high, not only against women, but there is no, in fact, prevention policies. Leila, you talked about the constitutional issue and also the human rights treaties, and I am here in front of CEDAW, the Convention for all sort of discrimination against women elimination. And yet Brazil committed itself to condemn any sort of discrimination against women. And also Brazil commit is committed to adopt, implement proper measures to prevent the women's discrimination in every environment. So if Brazil signs this convention in a global scope, that is our International Women Letter, and still we see that taking place. I mean, and I am greeting here coming campus that is watching us and said about to suit to establish a process to discuss the constitutionality of these rules of public service application. She's a professor, one of the biggest authors and writers regarding the law feminist theory, and in addition to being in addition of being researcher that sheds light to the importance to discuss that. If you are talking about public security and have women, we want women in the front line in this service. And I stress the importance of male police officers and female police officers to be provided of this, to have um, the gender aspects and also racial aspects formation, because women, they are discriminated, but black women, they serve even more. As Samira told us, the black woman femicide increased and the white women femicide decreased. So this is a sign that we still have a colonial country. So we have this idea of this Brazil colony, this colonizing aspect and racist aspect of the country. And this is very important to a so important topic. And Thiago asked me and the police chief Adriana Romana, and also Ruby ABS, Fabiana Severi, the professor Geralda Rezende from UNB, Cláudia Delegado is the police chief, all the police chief officers present here in this event that is so important to have here, the professor from Pater as well, also talking about the experience, and Professor Carey talking about the experience from Australia, and also what Samira we have here in the chat for those who is attending the public service rules for the police forces in Mato Grosso do Sul and Ceará that also brings this limitation for women to join the police forces. So I think this is a topic that we need to reflect. I think that more and more we have women in the police forces, security forces, it's better, and with more qualified women in this service. And also, not only that, but also it's about representation. I think that's very important to see a police force that represents us. And as we have in the judge system, there is no limit for women. As we are seeing a change that today in the public service application, we have equal numbers from men and women. For job position progression, it's different. For promotion, the female participation in the judicial power, the judicial branch, in the superior courts and national council. But the first degree, women managed to join the judicial branch through public application, because I follow all the applications in Brazil. Eventually, here in the state, from 52, we have only one woman and 41 men. But the past application was 50-50, and the previous one more women. So this has been varying, and we were discussing because why we have only 11, and most of them said as the application took place 2 years, it started in 2019 to 2022. We have a pandemic in the middle of that, the process, and we know that the pandemic impacted in different ways, in different proportions, women. So these are factors that we need to take into consideration when we analyze the pandemic and the impact in the women's life, not only to women to access justice, right, Leila? Not only the hardship that women had to go to a police station during the pandemic, some of them were closed. The judicial branch closed as well with virtual access, and the digital exclusion is a fact in Brazil. And we have no argument against fact. We cannot say, right, Samila and Leila and Carrie, heading the end of our event, we have 3 minutes, the lack of sanitation, digital exclusion, and the lack of food security. And you can ask what all of that has to do with justice. Everything is inside the same structure. And the lack of toilets, restrooms inside the households, and the lack of drinking water impacted women's lives during the pandemic, especially in the moment that we need to wash our hands, etc. So everything impacts in the front line, the just access. And here in Rio de Janeiro, we try through our network meetings, we understood that all of that had an impact and prejudice to women and also children, with schools closing, and impacted mothers' lives, women's lives. So all of that are problems. I see that Professor Carey spoke in Spanish, and I understand what she's writing in the chat box. And all of that is a phenomenon complex of inequality, social inequality and political inequality that Brazil is facing. And we will have a huge prejudice, I see, not in mid and long term, actually in short term, children with no school, women with no food security. The cell phone is an object for women's empowerment. A woman with no cell phone cannot ask for help, call 911, can't do anything. So I think that this reflection, a reflection here as a final remarks. I give the floor first to Professor Kerr for her final remarks, and because we're heading the end. So Professor Kerr, final remarks, and then dear Leila, and finally Samira, and then we finish our event.
Okay. Obrigada. Gracias todos para me escuchar. Tengo espera. I have hope. I have hope for a better future, and these problems are very much interlinked. Inequality. Of course, the women who are most vulnerable to domestic violence and to lethal violence do come from the poorest sectors in our societies, both in Australia and in Brazil. But you at least have some more of the solutions than we do. It's just so don't look to Australia for your model. We're probably we haven't improved at all, and I'm looking at your model, parts of your model, hopefully to decrease those rates of femicide and violence against women. Thank you, Tiago, and thank you to the embassies of Australia and Brazil for organising this. Obrigada.
Obrigada, professora Carey. Obrigada mesmo pela
Thank you,
presença.
Professor Carey. Thank you for your presence here and for all the considerations and for all the role that I know the Embassy of Australia is making, all the efforts for this dialogue, Brazil and Australia, to be more fruitful and closer for us to exchange more experiences. I'd like to thank you for your participation. Professor Leila? Yes, I share this feeling that it is possible to change that Professor Carey has brought. I believe we should have hope and also to bring the power of women from the women's movements to pressure for that to change. We know it's not easy, especially in the current times, but this is a hope that we should have. And Adriana has brought the data on Black women, and we must call the attention to the growth and the strengthening of the women's movement within the feminism and how that has been very important for this racial issue to be looked into as something fundamental for feminism and public policies. I'm very happy to have participated in this seminar to and to hear Professor Carey and to hear Samira, who's sharing with Adriana. And I'm very thankful to Professor Tiago for this initiative. Thank you very much. Samira, oh yeah, well, I'd just like to thank all our professors that were here. It was a pleasure. I have learned a lot. I learned with the audience. We have an amazing audience. It's almost 8 o'clock at night here in Brazil, and we have them all here. I'd like to thank Professor Tiago for the invitation. I was very happy to be here, and I continue hopeful. I remain hopeful. I believe the feminist movement, especially the ones that are just joined. I have some 16-year-old colleagues that are very active, and I am sure that the future will be better, but we must work. There's still a lot for their future, a lot to do for the future should be better. Thank you. Thank you, dear Samira, Katia Garces, as well. Uh, Samira, I want some this optimism as well. It was a great event. Christiane also mentioned that. I'd like to congratulations to the Public Prosecutor's Office of Brasilia for this initiative, the Embassy of Australia as well, and all the partner institutions. I believe it is very important to have this debate. Amanda as well. What a great event. And I'm very happy to have had this opportunity. I apologize in the beginning. I had power issues here, but I was able to finally be here. And there is a quote that to break the silence that Professor Carey has brought, for all the women to break the silence and to find in public security and justice or whatever they look for them to be heard and to break this silence. But it's not only to be heard, it's to be heard with qualified ears, with an actively for them to have a protection, because it is the right of all women to live a life free of violence. Always reminding that the convention or CEDAW, established on Article 11 that all women have the right to choose freely their profession. So if they want to be police women, judges, defenders, whatever they want, they must have this right because that's how our our Constitution says. And I'd like to thank Tiago for the invitation to mediate. I'd like to thank the opportunity to hear Professor Carrington. I hope I can see her here, and I hope I can have everybody from this amazing country that unfortunately I don't know yet, but and our dear Leila Linhares, once again, thank you for our participation. That was always great and very powerful. And Samira, is always great to hear. Always bring data in all my classes, and with those data that we must foster and create public policies to prevent violence and to provide assistance to these women in Brazil. So I send my best to all of you, and I'll see you next time.
Obrigada, Leila.